Welcome back to the Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I'm David Kern, and today is Wednesday, May 6, 2020. Today's poem is by Theodore J. Kooser, also known as Ted Kooser, a favorite of mine. He served as poet laureate, consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress from 2004 to 2006. And he's still living, actually. He was born in 1939, and as I said, he's one of my favorites. So I regularly turn to him. Haven't read one of his poems on this podcast since sometime last year, I think in November. So I wanted to read one of my favorites to you. This is a pretty melancholy poem, so I apologize for that in advance, but it's called Abandoned Farmhouse. He was a big man, says the size of his shoes on a pile of broken dishes by the house. A tall man, too, says the length of the bed in an upstairs room. And a good, God-fearing man, says the Bible with a broken back on the floor below the window, dusty with sun. But not a man for farming, say the fields cluttered with boulders and the leaky barn. A woman lived with him, says the bedroom wall papered with lilacs and the kitchen shelves covered with oilcloth. And they had a child, says the sandbox made from a tractor tire. Money was scarce, say the jars of plum preserves and canned tomatoes sealed in the cellar hole. And the winter's cold, say the rags in the window frames. It was lonely here, says the narrow country road. Something went wrong, says the empty house in the weed-choked yard. Stones in the field say he was not a farmer. The still sealed jars in the cellar say she left in a nervous haste. And the child? Its toys are strewn in the yard like branches after a storm. A rubber cow, a rusty tractor with a broken plow, a doll in overalls. Something went wrong, they say. So as I said, this is a melancholy poem. In some ways, I suppose it's not the right time. We're not living in the right times for a melancholy poem. But what I like about this poem is two things. One, I like the incantational nature of it that I think is suited to the melancholy themes of the poem. The repetition of the word says creates a sort of call and response in a way. He was a big man, says the size of his shoes. A tall man, too, says the length of the bed. A God-fearing man, says the Bible, and so forth. We get that 8 or 9 times throughout the whole poem, including in the final 2 words of the poem. Something went wrong, they say. So there's the incantational nature of the poem. That repetition is suited to the melancholy of the poem. But there's also, one of the things that makes this melancholy, that makes this poem sad and a little foreboding, is the way there's some dramatic irony in the poem, because at the beginning of the poem, we get this idea that he's big and strong and tall and God-fearing. And so the implication of all these early lines, all these early images, suggest that he was successful because he did the right things and he was prepared for the lifestyle. But then quickly it begins to turn. The woman seems to have been good at keeping the house. She added her bits of beauty as she could. Together they took care of the child who had things to play with. And so she was thrifty, although money was scarce. She prepared for the winters. They did the best they could. And yet in the end, something went wrong. And there's a sort of tragedy, there's a sort of tragic irony about that, that although the farmer and the wife, although they did what they could, things didn't work out. This, of course, is, melancholy, not a foreign idea to any of us. We're all trying to do the best we can, and sometimes things don't work out and we move on to the next thing. Sometimes we don't have any other choice. But one other thing that I like about this poem is Ted Kooser's eye for poetry. You imagine him coming across this abandoned farmhouse in the woods somewhere, or alongside an old field, maybe while hiking, in Nebraska where he lives, or perhaps while on a drive, and he saw the house off by the side of the road and he thought to go explore it. His imagination took him there. But then his imagination interpreted, it took the details that he saw, these leftover things, the remnants of an actual life, and he gave them a face, if you will. He gave them hope. He gave them dreams. Ultimately, he interpreted what happened as sort of the remnants of those hopes and dreams. But you also wonder what comes next for these people. And he gave this leftover bed, these leftover toys, these leftover boots. He gave them, he endowed with human feet and human hands. And in some ways, I think that's the work of poetry, to interpret the things that you see, and to humanize them, to make them part of an imagined life, or to imagine life out of them. Even while recognizing the harsh realities that sometimes come with such a life. And I think Kooser is really, really good at that, and this poem really captures that. So one more time here is Abandoned Farmhouse by Ted Kooser. He was a big man, says the size of his boots on a pile of broken dishes by the house. A tall man, too, says the length of the bed in an upstairs room. And a good, God-fearing man, says the Bible with a broken back on the floor below the window, dusty with sun. But not a man for farming, say the fields, cluttered with boulders, and the leaky barn. A woman lived with him, says the bedroom wall papered with lilacs, and the kitchen shelves covered with oilcloth, and they had a child, says the sandbox made from a tractor tire. Money was scarce, say the jars of plum preserves and canned tomatoes sealed in the cellar hole, and the winter's cold, say the rags in the window frames. It was lonely here, says the narrow country road. Something went wrong, says the empty house in the weed-choked yard. Stones in the field say he was not a farmer. The still sealed jars in the cellar say she left in a nervous haste. And the child? Its toys are strewn in the yard like branches after a storm. A rubber cow, a rusty tractor with a broken plow, a doll in overalls. Something went wrong, they say. This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. I will be back tomorrow with another poem for you.